And if you want to read more about this rise in distress among college students, here's an article that I'd recommend to you. It looks at both our Healthy Minds data as well as the American College Health Association data. And part of the researchers are trying to understand, of course, what's going on with this rise in distress. And one potential culprit is social and digital media. And there's some interesting research along those lines. Just in short, I would say, I think some of it is compelling. Some of the correlations, it's certainly not proven, but I do think that is part of the picture, not all of the picture. Also, you probably have seen many reports or even experiencing this at your own campus, that students are seeking help more than ever. And it's been difficult for campuses to keep up with the demand for services. And in fact, in our data, this is not just campus service use, this is just any therapy or counseling that students are using has gone from 13% of students now to around 30% of students who have used therapy at least once in the previous year for their mental or emotional health. If you look at just students with current symptoms of depression or anxiety, the percentage that are using services, this is current service use, either medication or therapy or both, it was gone from about 20% to around 36%. So it's notable in the rise, but also in the fact that it's still fewer than half of students with apparent symptoms, significant symptoms, are actually using mental health services. So it's far from everybody who's using it, even though there has been this steep rise. We have some very basic measures of stigma, and Professor Link is going to talk in more detail about this topic, but I think it's kind of nice to be presenting on the panel with him, because our measures of stigma were adapted from the beginning in our study, adapted from his discrimination devaluation scale. And here it's just a version of personal stigma, you might call it, where we ask students, do you agree with the statement, I would think less of someone who has used mental health treatment? And it's never been a high percentage, but it has gone down quite a bit. So now it's a really small percentage. So at least reported stigma seems quite low, but there are plenty of caveats to that, which I think Professor Link will probably address to some degree. If you want to read more about the rise in service use by college students, here's another article that I recommend to you. This is by our team, led by Sarah Ketchen-Lipson at Boston University. We've also explored many risk and protective factors correlated with depression and anxiety and eating disorders. And some of the factors that you'd probably expect are in fact very highly correlated with mental health. So I've just listed some of them here. Just in the interest of time, we can talk about it later, but I won't go into detail. Also, we've been collecting data all along, and even during this past year, during past several months, since the pandemic has started. So we're starting to see some data, and there are other researchers also coming out with reports of increased distress, even beyond the trends that I already showed you, increased distress during the pandemic, which is no surprise. So let me show you some of our numbers. This is from, this was, I think, 14 different institutions. We actually partnered with ACHA to combine our data and with a common set of questions related to the pandemic this past spring. This is right after the pandemic, right after the stay-at-home order started, so mostly in April. And so students are already at that point reporting that their financial situation has been highly affected. More than half say it's become more stressful. Mental health care, more than half of students who have used any services in the previous year are saying that the pandemic has made it more difficult to access services. Actually, in terms of whether distress had risen at that point, this is March through May, early part of the kind of severe impact of the pandemic in the United States. That it's actually not such a dramatic rise in distress. There is some rise in students experiencing significant depressive symptoms, but overall, it's at that point, I think it wasn't as strong as we're seeing some of the more recent results. And we're collecting a lot of data this fall, so we'll be able to see how things have evolved since then soon. I want to talk a little bit about equity and discrimination, because I know that's on a lot of people's minds these days. And so Here, I'm showing the percent of students who report that they've experienced any discrimination in the previous year due to their race, ethnicity, culture, or shoot, I can't remember the exact wording, but it's that race, ethnicity is definitely part of this question. And you can see each bar here represents another institution from our study. There's quite a variation. At some institutions, it's only about 10% of students saying that they report experience discrimination. Other institutions, it's closer to 50%. So there's quite a spread, although most institutions are more in the range of 20 to 30%. Now, when you break it down by race, ethnicity, as you might have expected, Black students are and other students of color are much more likely to report that they've experienced some form of discrimination in the previous year. It's over half of Black students. It's a sobering statistic there. Also, over half of students who report that they're bisexual or gay or lesbian. So again, equity is more important than ever. We also see that in our data that students of color generally are less likely to access mental health services. And that has implications not just for health, but also the ability to remain in college and graduate, because some of our other research has shown that depressive symptoms are associated with approximately a twofold higher risk of leaving college without graduating. Okay, so just to turn to a little bit more positive side of things, kind of what are some potential solutions for these growing challenges? I recommend to you, first of all, the Steve Fund's work. This is a relatively new organization focused on the mental health of students of color. And in collaboration with the JED Foundation, they have come up with an equity and mental health framework, which has a series of recommendations for campuses to better address equity with respect to student health and well-being. Also, from our research, one of the most compelling pieces, I think, for campuses has been our economic case or return on investment for investing more in student mental health. And basically this is taking our findings that I just mentioned before about how depression is correlated with dropping out from college and then converting that into a case where we could say to a campus, well, if you wanted to invest or make the case to invest more in services, whether it's treatment or prevention, as long as it's effective, then generally we can project that the costs of those services are going to be quite a bit less than the economic benefits in terms of, first of all, potentially retaining more tuition by keeping more students. And second of all, more importantly, allowing students to progress further in college, in their college education, attain more education, and ultimately have a much higher expected lifetime earnings and productivity. These days, of course, another solution that is frequently being talked about in campuses is digital services, digital therapy. And so our team is involved in a large randomized trial of a cognitive behavioral therapy program called Silver Cloud on 20 well, it's probably gonna end up being more than 20 campuses. We're still enrolling campuses actually. So if any of your campuses are interested in joining, it's a nice way to, a lot of your students will get free access to this program, and you'll be contributing to knowledge about this important question of what is the impact of offering students online therapy as a supplement to their usual services. Now, lastly, I want to mention that our group is thinking more and more about what we're calling our best practices initiative, which is essentially, can we give campuses better access to information about what actually works? What are the best practices? And what I mean, and specifically, I mean programs or initiatives that are population level, kind of public health approaches. So it's not so much clinical services where I think we have better information, although we still need more research. But in terms of population level approaches to mental health and well-being, what really is effective? What's the quality of evidence for different programs, or even just what are other campuses doing? Can we document that more thoroughly so that if your campus is interested in a program, you can immediately see who else is using that program alongside the evidence for that program. So actually in the area of alcohol use, there is already, I think, a version of this best practices initiative called College Aim. Maybe it's come up at this conference already, or certainly some of you probably know about this, but that I think is a nice example of it. They provide this matrix of options that campuses could choose. This is a screenshot from their website, and They give some evidence, they give us a summary of what's the quality of evidence and also what the costs are to implement. So what our group is thinking about is, can we do something like this for mental health more broadly, not just alcohol use? And we also are hoping to make it a more interactive resource. So it's not just a website that you go to, but it's actually like a whole network of people and organizations that you can connect with and discuss your options for addressing student mental health and well-being more effectively. So here's my contact information. I'd love to meet many of you, and feel free to get in touch. And I'll now turn it over to Professor Link. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing my screen. Let's see.
Thank you, Dr. Eisenberg.
Thank you.
Okay, so it looks like we are going to move on to Dr. Link now. And I just want to encourage all of our attendees, if you have any questions, you can put those in the Q&A or the chat, either or. I'll get to both of them. So let us know if you have any questions. Okay, Dr. Link. You're on mute and we can't see you.
Start video.
Okay, we can hear you, Bruce.
You can hear me now. I'll try to say reasonable things then. Let's see. Now, I'm still working on this. Okay, share screen. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, but we can't see you. One option, Bruce, you could send me your slides to my email, and then I can share from my screen.
Okay. I don't know why I push share screen and it doesn't allow me to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll be right with you. Maybe Daniel can take a question while I do this.
Yeah, it's actually perfect because we have a question in the chat right now. So Francis asks, how would you assess the value of CRPs given the high levels of depression and stress in our finding?
I have to admit, I'm not sure what CRP is referring to. Does anybody consider?
Collegiate recovery programs.
Oh.
Sorry.
Well, I think, I actually think the collegiate recovery program is an example of a best practice as far as I know. I don't know the evidence inside and out, but I think maybe it's in that college aim matrix. I think it is high up there in terms of evidence quality. So, and clearly, alcohol and drug abuse are highly correlated with depression and anxiety and stress. So in that sense, I think it's got its high value. It's the type of program, again, from what I understand the evidence, the type of program that we'd like to promote. And maybe we could, and we're focusing more on kind of the folks who focus on depression and anxiety. It's the type of program we'd also like to make sure that they're fully aware of. I know it's spread quite well around the country. But I think when I talk about the best practices initiative, it's that type of program that we want to help get the word out and help support campuses in implementing. And then there's a question about how campuses enroll in a multi-study. You can just send an email to me, Daniel Eisenberg at ucla.edu, that's the easiest way. Thanks.
Okay. And I sent them to you.
Okay, it hasn't arrived yet, but hopefully it will in just a moment.
Is there any trick to sharing my screen?
Yeah, let me just make sure that, okay, you are a co-host. Do you want to go ahead and try it again, Bruce? Just using the green share.
Is there a share screen, the little green button at the bottom? Do you see it or is it not there?
I don't know what I'm seeing now for some reason. I'm just seeing a little me in the midst of a whole bunch of other stuff. Yeah. It was fine when I started, and then it.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure why it hasn't come through. Perhaps you could forward it to Shayna as well, just in case.
Let me try one more time. It says share your screen that says your entire screen application window. And if I push my entire, it won't allow me to do it.
Bruce, would you be able to drop your slides into the chat? So all you have to do is take the PowerPoint slides on your computer and then put them into the chat.
Yeah, just drag it over. And if you want, you can just send it to Anne.
I did send it to Anne already.
Yeah, for some reason it's not coming up. It could be because it's too big.
Sorry, I'm so clumsy at this.
It's okay. Okay.
I don't know how to put it in my chat, I guess.
Okay. Can you forward the email you sent to Shayna?
Okay.
She might be better able to accept it. Sometimes with the School of Medicine, my email's a little slow.
Are you on a desktop, laptop, or iPad?
I'm on a laptop. Okay.
And then I think, Bruce, if you don't mind, you could just begin presenting. We won't be able to see your slides, but as soon as Shayna or I receive them, we'll begin to share our screen.
Okay.
I'm refreshing my email so I can see it if it comes in.
All right, I just sent it to you, Shayna.
Okay.
All right. Okay, let me get started. First of all, sorry for about all that. Can you folks see me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. All right, so I'll behave. Anyway, my topic is addiction stigma. And here's what I hope to accomplish today as several orienting questions concerning stigma and addiction recovery. And I'm going to ask, how are things that are stigmatized similar to each other? So a whole lot of things are stigmatized. How are they alike? And what is the essence of stigma? And then I'll ask the question, when we think about that, does the stigma concept apply to addiction, and how so? The second thing, so that's the first, the second thing is how are things that are stigmatized different from each other? So there are going to be a whole lot of things that are stigmatized, but they're really very different from each other. And how can we think about them being different, and how is addiction stigma unique? And then I want to say a little bit about how stigma can be enacted, and in what ways can addiction stigma influence recovery. And then if we have time, I want to give you an example from my own research, and hopefully by that time we'll have the slides because it'll be really important at that point. Some work I've done with Helena Hansen, who's a famous psychiatrist, anthropologist, who studies addiction stigma. And I've done some work with her on that, and I'll show you some preliminary results about that. Okay, so that's my agenda. And now the first thing I want to talk to you about is just think about all the different things that can have the word stigma attached to them. So mental illness, drug addiction, prostitution, psoriasis, irritable bowel syndrome, incarceration, obesity, undocumented, chronic health problems, learning disabilities, and it goes on and on. That's the short list. So there's all these different things, and they're all so different. Is there anything, what's central about them that we use the word stigma with respect to them? So what is stigma? So if you go back in time, you could go back to the very famous book by Irving Goffman called Stigma, Notes on the Management of Spoiled Identity. And in that book, Goffman, has all sorts of different definitions of stigma, but one that's stuck and people often indicate is an attribute that's deeply discrediting and reduces the bearer from a whole and usual person to a tainted, discounted one. And then another definition came from a guy named Amerigo Farina in a book called Social Stigma. And he called it a mark that sets a person apart and links the marked person to undesirable characteristics. Now, if you listen with a very close ear to those definitions, and if you happen to be one of the folks who's in the category that's called stigmatized, is there anything that you would find inadequate or undesirable about the definitions you just heard? Well, people who have been subject to stigma did criticize those two definitions. And one way they criticized them is that they had the word attribute or mark in them. Goffman's had attribute, Farina's had mark. And then that suggests that what is stigmatized is something that the person possesses, rather than something that is conferred or selected for social salience. So it's something about you, and that's embedded in the definition. They didn't like that because they felt that the stigmatization came from other people designating them and saying and focusing particularly on the circumstance that they were in. So the second criticism was that a lot of it focused on the linking of the categorization to stereotypes and not on the broad discrimination and social exclusion. So much of what was going on was about what was going on in people's heads, designation and stereotypes. Now, certainly those are very important, but people didn't see enough focused on the full range of being discriminated against and excluded. And we used those two criticisms to leverage a new thinking about what stigma was. And we decided that stigma, there's all these words, I just used a bunch of them, labels, stereotypes. We decided that stigma can be thought of as in the combination, in the convergence of multiple aspects, and that this is what we should call something that's stigmatized. So the first is that people distinguish and label human differences. The second is that labeled persons are linked to undesirable characteristics, to unwarranted negative stereotypes. I'll spend a little time on each of these. And the third is labeled persons are viewed as an outgroup, as them and not us. And as a fourth component is that people experience status loss and discrimination. And the fifth component is that stigma is really dependent on power. And that was kind of the most important part of this new rethinking through of the stigma concept. Shayna, is there any chance that you have the slides yet?
Yes, I'm moving along with you right now.
Oh, great. So people can see them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. That helps me then to know how to present them. Okay, great. So this first component is distinguishing and labeling human differences. And if you think about all the ways we differ, there's just a vast number of things that are different about us. And most of these get ignored. So for example, hairy ears get ignored. Some people have hairy ears, some people don't. And we don't pay much attention to that. It's just not, it's not brought the social salience. Now the picture of the guy here, it would be hard not to bring his hairy ears to light, but generally, we don't think about it. We could. People with hairy ears are more likely to be violent than people without them, because males have hairy ears and women don't. Females don't. So, things could come up about it, but it's ignored. And there are all sorts of things that are ignored. And then other things are so taken for granted that we don't recognize that we're selecting them out for salience. They just seem so prominent, like having one leg instead of two. But the person on the other side, the person who has the one leg, he's a whole person except for that one thing. And that strong focus on that one aspect of him is a selecting out of this social salience. Then once you have this label or designation, so this is something we're doing to people who are in the stigmatized condition, the people who don't have it, they're calling it out. So that's responding to that one criticism. Then linking the labeled person to negative stereotypes. So if I believe you are a person with mental illness, then I also think you're dangerous. Making these associations. Person with psoriasis, dirty, aroma gypsy, slyly criminal. You get the idea there. It's that linking. And then there's the third part is that people are separated. And there's an us and there's a them. And the person on the stigmatized status is considered, is thought of it different and them. And sometimes it's a fundamental difference. In the extreme, they are no longer really human, and they don't matter. It would be is the us-theming part. So Black Lives Matter is responding to the us-theming part. And then status loss and discrimination. Stigma involves a downward placement in a social hierarchy, a disenfranchisement as a valued person, as somebody of worth. That was in Goffman's. Disrespect is provided to you. And then there's discrimination in jobs, housing, schooling, friendships, intimate relationships, and general exclusion from key domains of social experience. Now, if you think about those things I just presented to you, and then you think about power, it takes power to stigmatize. Powerless people don't have as much opportunity to stigmatize other people. It takes power to do that. It takes power to decide which characteristics to make salient. We take this for granted a lot, but somebody decides what becomes salient when we interact with one another. What comes to the fore? It takes power to create the ambient stereotypes. That don't come from God. These are things we make up, and some people have the power to make the stereotypes and to make them stick, and other people have less of that power. And then the power to broadly accomplish the separation of us and them. So that takes power as well. And then finally, the power to exclude from desirable jobs, housing, educational opportunities, and so on. You have to have access to those things in order to exclude people. It takes power to pull it all off. Okay, so that's the power. That's the idea of what might be at the essence. That should characterize every stigmatized circumstance we think about. So with addiction stigma, we have labels. You could use, people say things like they call people an addict, abuser, a junkie. It could get worse than that. And in doing that, they've not called it a person with addiction, but an addict. You are that. So you see that with addiction. There are stereotypes, moral weakness, flawed character, dangerousness. There is separation, us and them, via like the labels I just put up there. And there can be disrespect and lesser value assigned to a person who has addiction. And then discrimination. It can be interpersonal rejection. I don't have anything to do with you. It can be structural stigma. I'm not going to allow you into this housing. It can be an internalization of stereotypes that people take these on and they get inside them. I'll say more about those in a minute. So I think, you've seen this concept of stigma. It can apply to addiction stigma. Now, how are stigmatizing circumstances different from each other? I mean, I read you a list of a bunch of things that are stigmatized. They seem so different. Irritable bowel syndrome and Down syndrome, and being undocumented. So there are ways of thinking about how stigmatized circumstances are different from each other. And it comes from these famous people, Jones and Farina. Now I won't read all of these because I'm going to go through each one and describe it a little bit. And as we do, you can think about addiction stigma and what's prominent and separate and distinct about addiction stigma. So first, concealment. So can the stigmatizing circumstance be concealed, either directly or by controlling information? So things that are concealable, at least to some extent, are designations as gay and lesbian. Mental illness is somewhat, you sort of conceal it, a criminal record. Now this doesn't fully penetrate. Sometimes the concealment can't be done, but it's possible. But then there's things that are not concealable, like paraplegia, facial disfigurement, and dwarfism. So stigmas can vary on concealment. They can vary on the course. Some stigmatizing circumstances are reversible, like you can have a hair lip, an operation that can be reversed. Others are variable and unpredictable, like irritable bowel syndrome. You don't know when it's going to happen, and that makes it a different kind of a situation. Others cannot be changed, like dwarfism or Down syndrome. So that's another way stigmatizing circumstances can be different. Then some stigmatizing circumstances can be disruptive. To what extent does the stigmatizing circumstance make smooth interaction with the stigmatized difficult? So if you were sitting down to have a talk with this person and you hadn't gotten used to their facial disfigurement, you could have a hard time knowing what to do with your eyes and not focusing just on the facial disfigurement. So that would disrupt the interaction. It makes it hard for the person who's stigmatized. The whole interaction could be so, and others are not like that. Other stigmatized circumstances are not like that. They can vary on aesthetics. So the stigmatizing circumstance evokes a visceral, discomforting response in the stigmatized. So leprosy might do that. It's kind of this ew phenomenon. But other stigmatizing circumstances don't have that aesthetic quality to them. And here's one when you're thinking about it. Addiction stigma is really important. That's the origin. Is the stigmatizing circumstance under the stigmatized person's control? So people believe that addiction is alcoholism, pedophilia. People in the general population often believe that, but they wouldn't think other things are, like Down syndrome or racial characteristics or or dwarfism. So stigmas can vary on that. And then peril. Is the stigmatized person a danger or a threat? So people with psychotic symptoms may be violent, or they could be seen as people could be seen as relatively harmless, like a blind person, a deaf person, or a person with Down syndrome. So is peril involved? So these are ways stigmatized circumstances can differ one from the other. So if we go to addiction stigma, we think of things that really jump out from that list of ways that could be different. Is concealment to some degree interpersonally, or by going to a source of treatment where it's concealed, the nature of the treatment setting and so on. So concealment is an issue with respect to addiction. Do you tell people? Do you not tell people? If you're someone with a facial disfigurement, you don't have to decide whether to tell them or not. It's right there. But around addiction stigma, it's an issue you have to deal with. The origin then is huge. Blame. Do people blame and then punish and deny treatment, benefits, respect? And then is there a fear? And in the public, there is substantial fear about people who have addiction. So that's some concept about how to think about stigma around addiction, drawing from the general stigma literature. How might stigma affect people with addiction? Well, it's very important to think about it at multiple levels: a structural level, interpersonal, and then internal to the person. So at the structural level, policies and procedures can either facilitate or work against stigmatization. So you can either treat people or you can punish them. So that's a policy. And stigma influences which one of those you choose and who you choose it for. If it's Black and brown people involved, you're more likely to use punishment. If it's white people, you're more likely to involve treatment in our general population, the way things are now. And then there's access to insurance, housing, employment. Are you restricted in those things? So those are structural forms of stigma. Then interpersonal is probably what you usually think about. You can treat a person with disrespect. this can happen everywhere, but it could happen in the criminal justice system where if you're blamed for it and then punished, or in the medical system if it's kind of brought up and you feel uncomfortable going there. Or people can discriminate and choose not to interact, date, hire a person with a history of addiction. So those would be interpersonal forms. And then social psychological processes operating through the person. So if you know people can discriminate, you might have to anticipate, oh, is this going to happen to me? And it's on your mind. And then if it's strongly on your mind, you go into this circumstance and you have to be vigilant. Is this going to happen to me? Are they going to say something disrespectful to me? What am I going to do about it? And then if it can also lead you to ruminate about it. You've got to worry about it because it might happen. And so then it comes, so that you ruminate about it. And those are unpleasant, perhaps, to experience. But in addition, it takes up cognitive work. You have to be doing that and not thinking about how you're going to convince this person to hire you. You're worried about this other stuff. It gets added on. It's an eternal burden, an additional burden. And then one of the most painful things for me, I mean, it's all painful, but one of the most painful things for me is if the person accepts it and takes the disrespect inside and feels this disrespect towards themselves. Now, this doesn't happen to everybody, and it varies. And if I get, but these are things we need to think about and worry about with respect to stigma. And, you're totally stuck? Well, no. There's ways you can resist. And this is thinking, you can do things to help yourself with your addiction, but you can also fight back against the stigma. And you can do it cognitively. You can say, not me. Those people think that, and I know they think that, but basically they're wrong. That's not me. I'm a bigger person than that. I'm not just the addiction. I'm the blame put on me for it is misapplied at this point and not me. Or you can challenge if someone says something ridiculous, you can say, you just said something stigmatizing, I take offense. I'm a person with addiction and I wish you wouldn't say things like that. That's a hard thing to do and it can get bad feedback, but you can respond back in that way. And then third, there's probably many more ways than this, but the third is to mobilize, support one another, push for policy change through social movements. Engaging in a social movement that change the stigma. These are things that could possibly support stigma resistance. How am I doing on time, Shayna?
You're doing good. You're good.
Okay, I'll do this fairly rapidly. This is to give an example of work that I'm currently doing. So it's not perfect, and there's all sorts of things we could talk about it, but I think it's really interesting and reflects some of how things can be, some of how stigma can impact people. And I'm doing it with my great scholar friend, Helena Hansen, who's both an anthropologist and a psychiatrist. So she speaks two languages about these things. She's a very qualitative person, but because she knew me and I'm sort of more quantitative, although I love qualitative work, she and I joined together and we asked some quantitative questions of people in one of her studies, 72 people in clinic treatment in New York City. And what we asked is this stigma associated with low self-esteem and an inclination to avoid others. So one way stigma could hurt you, it could lower your self-esteem, and you could just say, I'm not going to interact because I'm anticipating rejection from other people. And then can challenging stigma interrupt any negative consequences? We'll look at this pretty briefly. Now I'll show you how these measures go, and I won't read them all because we don't have time, but you'll get the idea. These are the things I'm trying to assess. So experienced rejection by people, these folks in the clinic. So they've been refused an apartment, being treated unfairly, have employers pay you lower wages, if some of your friends treat you differently, avoid you because they knew you had been addicted, use the fact that you had been addicted to hurt your feelings. And there's this isn't all of them. There are others that are in the measure, but that gives you an idea. And then do you feel this inside of you? Do you feel shame? Do you feel embarrassment? We're calling this self-stigma. How disappointed do you feel? Do you feel ashamed that you're treated for addiction? So that would be the internalization, taking the societal stereotypes and applying to yourself and feeling bad about yourself. And then we also measured stigma resistance. So, and just the challenging component that I mentioned. So tell someone you disagreed with them when they said something negative about people with addiction. Let someone know that they were being unfair to people with addiction. So basically talking back is the challenging, and that's a measure that we have of that. And we ask people these questions and we add them up and make a scale out of them. And then we ask about their self-esteem. So, you know, I wish I could have more respect for myself. Sometimes I think I'm no good at all. And then again, we add up the questions. We get an assessment of, you know, do they have a positive self-regard or do they have a negative self-regard? Then we ask just one question about withdrawing from interaction. Avoid seeing people you know because you've been addicted. So those are the measures. And then here's some questions we asked of that data, the 72 people. And if someone experiences rejection, do they feel more self-stigma? And this is from the bottom of the scale to the top of the scale. From the lowest on experiencing rejection, so that light green bar way to the left is the lowest, and at the top is those experiencing the most rejection. They're way at the top of the scale, and then the other bars are in the scale of rejection. So this is, have people rejected you a lot, and then do you feel guilty and ashamed? And if you're had a lot of rejection, you're much more likely to feel guilty and ashamed. So this doesn't just pop up in your mind. People do stuff to you, and it makes you feel guilty, ashamed, and so on. And then if someone experiences this self-stigma, that is, they feel guilty and ashamed about their addiction, do they experience lower self-esteem? So the more of this self-stigma people feel on the right-hand bar, the less likely they are to have a good self-esteem. They have lower self-esteem. They've low on self-stigma. They don't feel guilty and ashamed. They're much higher on self-esteem. So this kind of shows that the stigma process gets in and affects how people feel about themselves. Then if someone experiences rejection, do they avoid interactions with others? So this would be a harm. If you get rejected, you know, it kind of makes sense that you might avoid others because they reject you. And there's a really strong association from a lot of rejection. People really want to avoid others, to low rejection. They're not as likely, very much less likely to avoid others. So another way that stigma comes in to affect people. So, but were folks stuck? And so we asked, is challenging associated with self-esteem and avoiding others? So first with respect, so this is the idea of sort of talking back. And this is the challenging. If you're more likely to challenge, you have better self-esteem than if you're less likely to challenge. So this suggests that people can do something, can sort of say, I'm going to stand up for myself. And it seems, at least in these data, to have some positive effect for their self-esteem. And if they challenge, then they're less likely to avoid others. So that suggests that, you know, folks can take this coping orientation, apply it, and it might not make all the stigma consequences go away. And it does bring some risk that people get mad at you for challenging them and then reject you, but this is what our data shows so far. So this is what I just showed you, that these rejection experiences is other people doing stuff to you. It increases your self-stigma, guilt you feel. It increases your tendency to avoid others, and it also induces you to challenge stigma. People reject you, you can think about it leading them to challenge. Then self-stigma hurts. The more self-stigma, the lower the self-esteem, the negative, next to the arrow. And then challenging increases self-esteem, and challenging reduces avoidance of others. So that's just what I just showed you. And just to wrap up, what I've tried to present is concepts that are useful for thinking about how stigma influences recovery. So that definition of stigma, label, stereotypes, us, them, status loss, and discrimination. If you want to think about this phenomenon, these are some things that you can bring to bear in doing it. And so there's that. And then how addiction stigma is different from other stigmatized circumstances. We could go through those, and you can see that in a lot of ways it is different from other types of stigmatizing circumstances. And it's important to focus on those. And then how can stigma harm recovery? Well, through structural, interpersonal, or within the person ways that it can hurt you. And then how stigma can be resisted. We just, you can say, not me, cognitively. You can challenge it in social circumstances, or you can build movements that give social support and fight back. And then this empirical example, which dug down into some of these issues, where interpersonal rejection, is associated with internalization of self-stigma, and stigma resistance via challenging is beneficial in some ways. And so that's all I'll have to say. And I know I'm going to get to hear from a few commentators, and I'm so interested in being able to do that. With all the kerfuffle at the beginning, I didn't get to thank the people who developed this for inviting me. I'm so glad I had the chance to follow after Daniel's talk, which I really enjoyed hearing. And I was really grateful to have been introduced by one of the terrific graduate students in our sociology department, who I've been fortunate to have in two of my classes. Anyway, thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Dr. Link. Virtual applause for Dr. Eisenberg and Dr. Link. Okay, we are going to move on to our talk with Tyrone and Bailey. Let's see. Okay, yes. Okay, so Tyrone and Bailey, are you all ready? Perfect.
Who's going first, or is there anything? Who would you like to speak first?
Would you like to go first?
I guess I'll go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. So thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. Particularly Rachel Brand, who linked me up with the organization, the Collegiate Recovery Program. This is my experience thus far with the organization has been very positive. My experience thus far with the Bruins for Recovery Program, where I actually attend school at UCLA, has been very positive and very instrumental in my educational trajectory and helping me along with my program of recovery and my academic endeavors. Thank you, Dr. Eisenberg, and I hope I'm pronouncing your names correctly, and Dr. Link. I didn't really prepare any formal, but I'm gonna weave my story in. Is there a time limit that I have, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or whatever it is? Let me know. Is there anything?
We're
what?
going until 12:10. So
Okay.
It's 11:48 right now.
11:48 now. So I'll do this in 7-8 minutes. So when I think about stigma, and when I think about how that played a part in my own addiction and substance use, and how that has played a part in my recovery. And I think the question was asked, how does it influence our research, and how does it influence my recovery? I think after going into the recovery rooms, either in the general population or going into the recovery rooms and seeking service in an institution, a recovery place, stigma definitely plays a part. One of the things that I've ran across personally and have seen is when an African American shares in a meeting versus a white female or a white male, some of the comments that would take place in the shares that follow afterwards. For a white male, they'll get, "Oh, I'm so surprised to see that you're here," you know, and or you think, you know, it's this privilege that that individual has when they're sharing that's not extended to the African American person when they're in the rooms. And what I mean by that is, I don't know if I'm phrasing or framing it the right way for you to understand, but they don't associate substance use with the young lady with blonde or blue eyes. The comments that come about afterwards for the African American male are nothing similar to those types of comments at all. This morning, I had the opportunity to attend a CAM meeting, a Crystal Meth Anonymous meeting in New York. New York is very forward-thinking in their approach regarding recovery, and there are meetings directly just for the African American community, and that's just been really important. But what I want to do is back up and just tell you real quickly what led me down this line here is that, you know, when we talk about stigma and we talk about what led me to addiction, it was a genetic thing, but it also was the environment that I came from and the environment that I grew up in and the education that I received, the lack of Black literature that I did not receive in my education. So when we look at what research needs to take place, we also need to look at where is addiction formulating from other than just on the genetic side. What part does society play in causing the mental health issues of African American males? Higher education newsletter ran an article just the other day, and it's called The Emotional Toll on Racism. It was published on October the 23rd. And Black students continuously experience, fight against, and bear emotional scars from racism, which can lead to an increased anxiety and poor mental health outcomes. So at an early age for me, that's where that started. My lack of Du Bois, my lack of James Baldwin, my lack of Toni Morrison. I did not get that while I was in my early trajectory. I did not have the privilege of going to a school and open up a history book that showed my full identity. So when you look at my identity development, it was hindered by the dominant culture. It was hindered. I didn't have that privilege to see people who I could relate to, that I could sit up there and gain, and I did it and form that in my earlier development stages and stuff. I didn't get that until I was actually in prison, when a Black social worker and me working in a prison law library presented these books to me. And it was almost like a spiritual experience for me, being able to read these books by these Black authors, slave narratives, and books by Frederick Douglass. And, you know, when I look at mental health, where I'm at today, now I'm on the campus of UCLA. Before that, I was at Cal State Northridge. What programs that were really there for me? I sought mental health on campuses, but part of the problem is that there aren't any African American mental health clinicians really present. Not on their own accord, but due to, we just haven't really allowed the African American community to get the education that they need to be clinicians. You know, and that starts on at an early point in our lives. Our one program that I did take part in was the Revolutionary Scholars Program, which is now Project Rebound at Cal State Northridge. And those are two incredible programs that helped me understand and be around other individuals who are like myself. That were African American, that had some of the same life experiences that I had. And that has really helped. Now that I'm at UCLA, there's the underground, I know that I was asked to speak about the program, Underground Scholars Program. That is a new program for me at Underground at UCLA. It is a program for those that are formerly incarcerated. And it's a place that we get together and share our life experiences, share different ways to make it and navigate the predominantly white institutions or whatever institution that you're at and stuff. So, you know, recovery today for me looks different. When we talk about how does stigma play a part and hinder, you know, my recovery, you know, even when I go to the recovery rooms, I've been told by white therapists who are also in recovery, not breaking any of their intimate anonymity though, they'll walk up to me and say, oh, Tyrone, you're so articulate. You're a therapist, you're a clinician. You just got your degree. What school did you go to that let that come out of your mouth? That school, that institution failed you. And we have to look at these things here. What is causing these label stigma and this what you know, what is causing this? We have to look at that. And you know, now today, you know, how do I, you know, shame? So that also was a topic that I think Dr. Link brought up. So yeah, you know, shame does come around and it's somewhat in the back of my mind. But you know, now all these gifts that I've been given through recovery, through the 12 steps, I do work the steps, I do have a sponsor. The accolades, the honors, all the UCLA, I cannot make any of those things my higher power today. None of those things become my higher power. For me, I have to just use those tools, those awards, those accolades to use as tools to liberate my community, to actually help and serve other people, help to serve each and every one of you. So, I think that we just really should also have to look at what is the root cause of stigma? What is going on with society where, stigma is there, racism is there, the toll that racism is taking on those that are in recovery, and what is it that the rooms of recovery can do regarding addiction, and to actually make African Americans, and I'm speaking on behalf of African Americans because I'm African American, so make them more comfortable in these spaces and in these rooms. And so with that, I'll share. I hope there's other questions, and I'll probably have some more to say later on.
Thank you, Tyrone. Thank you for sharing that with us. Okay, I'm going to introduce Ryan. I apologize, I did not get your introduction in the beginning. So let's see. Ryan Hardin is an undergraduate student at UC Santa Cruz, a trans man and in recovery. He is a double major studying sociology and psychology. Ryan is actively involved in the UC Santa Cruz collegiate recovery community, Slugs for Health and Growth at the Cove. He is passionate about recovery and advocating for collegiate recovery resources and support. As a trans man, Ryan brings a unique perspective to the recovery community in Santa Cruz and hopes to expand his knowledge by learning from others with marginalized identities in his community, as well as supporting them wherever needed. So thank you for being here, and go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Shayna. Thank you, Tyrone. Thank you, Dr. Link. Thank you, Dr. Eisenberg, for sharing. Tyrone, I want to center your experiences for a minute and say congratulations on graduating the prison industrial system. And I'm so glad that Underground Scholars exists at UCLA. That is really exceptional. I'm glad that there's a community there for formerly incarcerated students. So my name is Ryan. I use he, him pronouns. And this is supposed to be student experiences across the UC pathways to recovery and what works. So I don't really know what to say besides what works for me. We can all say what works, and that's only going to be our own perspective from sitting right where we're at. So like Shayna said, I'm part of the Cove that's at UCSC, and proud slug. So Jorge Bru is the alcohol and other drug educator at UCSC, and Jorge basically leads with this radical love that I think it plays a huge part in my recovery and in the recovery of other students. So basically what works for me and what works for a lot of other people at UCSC is this openness, this friendliness, this believing in people. And that's pretty much at the base of what I think works. You have to focus on retaining students, and that has to do with putting them in positions of service and putting them in positions to be volunteer and to be proud of their work in their communities. Without community support, without communities attending, it's not a community. It's just, one person. It can feel very lonely. And without that community, you can feel like you're the only one who's in recovery at school. So it's important to be visible, and it's important to have people constantly working, volunteering. And I wanted to share something, since I'm kind of a Star Wars nerd. CNE Corbin from UC Berkeley said that we should focus on the Jedi way. This is for environmental science, but I think it applies here too. The environmental Jedi way, or the Jedi way, focuses on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Jedi spells Jedi, right? So that's what we need to focus on first: justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I'm just gonna quickly put a link to her information in the chat so that everyone can take a look at her work, because she's pretty cool, not gonna lie. And we also need to focus on white supremacy culture. Not only focus on it, but work against it actively. Learn the way that it fails us in our friendships, learn the way that it fails us in our relationships. Love and kindness and recovery should not be transactional. You shouldn't get better care because you are a better addict or a better looking addict or have white skin. So I would also like to share a document by Tema Okun, who writes on white supremacy culture. Here is, oops. Yeah, so hopefully that link works. It looks kind of funky right there. Please let me know if it doesn't work for anybody. But Tema Okun focuses on a lot. Okay, great, it works. Tema Okun focuses on a lot of aspects of white supremacy culture, like perfectionism, sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality, worship of the written word, only one right way, paternalism, either or thinking, power hoarding, fear of open conflict, individualism, I'm the only one, progress is bigger, more, objectivity, and right to comfort. Obviously, that's a lot to think of and a lot to look at, but it's important. And I really wanted to put that out there and say, you can't have these very inclusive spaces without working against the systems that try and pull us apart and make us fight each other. Be visible. Being visible really works. If no one can find your collegiate recovery program, then it's not effective. And yeah, that was pretty much it. And I had a little timer for myself because I wanted to say all that really quickly. And but yeah, so I have 1 minute left. So I guess I just want to say that I'm grateful for this opportunity to be able to share these resources with everyone, and say that this is working for me right now, is working on going against white supremacy cultures, is focusing on the Jedi way, and sticking with the cove, sticking with my community. And we can't build a community without the people in the community, and we need to openly, actively work to get people in our communities and get people in recovery, because otherwise I think a lot of people may fall through the cracks of the system as it currently is. So yeah, thank you so much.
Ryan. Thank you. Okay, we're going to introduce Bailey now. You're up, Bailey.
Hi there, my name is Bailey Van Tassell. I spoke yesterday at the Understanding Substance Use panel. Thank you so much to both Tyrone and Ryan for sharing your experiences. That is one of kind of the core things that I gained and am still gaining on my journey to recovery, is just hearing all of these experiences, being able to share my own experience, really kind of being able to democratize the ability to speak, I think is really important. Thank you, Dr. Link and Dr. Eisenberg, for your presentations. I thought they were really great. I think something that's kind of really interesting that we're all touching on is how do we access discrete communities within the larger recovery community? How do we access, and I guess kind of what I was saying before, how do we democratize this access? I'm so thankful for Ryan sharing his experience with the Cove. Unfortunately, at my time at UCSC, was not able to access the Cove just because I didn't get into it early enough. And, by the time I graduated, I had really just learned about it. But I've heard so much about what you do and Jorge's mission to kind of bring this radical self-love. And so that is a journey that I myself have taken in recovery, just kind of how do I practice that? How do I internalize that and make that part of my recovery journey? Because that, for me, what was really lacking was this appreciation of my own kind of ability and voice. So I think that's a big mission, is being able to share that voice, share those experiences. I don't really have much to say. I actually just learned about this morning, so I apologize. I'm not entirely prepared. But I just wanted to say thank you to everyone, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the presentations that go on throughout this weekend.
Thank you, Bailey. Thank you so much for sharing, all of you. It is now 12:06. As you know, the session will end at 12:10, but I would like to move into audience questions or any comments. So feel free to put those in the chat so everyone can see them if you'd like. Or even if you would just like to share your own experience in there.
So Shayna, I'll go ahead and read some of the questions for the Q&A chat.
Thank you.
So Rachel Brand has asked, what do you think is the greatest barrier for collegiate recovery programs?
So in your experience as students, what do you think the biggest barrier has been for the collegiate recovery programs?
I can again, Tyrone, I can speak from my own experience, is that when seeking mental health services on the campuses, I think that we sometimes say that African Americans don't want to seek mental health services. It's, as a student, and some of the discussions that we have, that I've had with some of my peers who are African Americans, we want mental health services. We just know that when we go there, no one looks like us. And my own personal experiences, I've worked with therapists in the past, and I'm going to get to that question. I just at a point in my life right now where I need a Black, male, preferably gay therapist. And getting that is hard as hell on the college campus, who can then maybe suggest, work with me, meet me where I'm at, to get me to go to a recovery meeting. So there's that barrier, because there is substance abuse on the college campuses amongst college students. So there's that one barrier there that exists. Not enough clinicians that look like me that could actually introduce me to, or suggest, or meet me where I'm at on my road of recovery, or in mental health, or just reaching out and stuff. So there's that barrier there. Thus far on campus, so far, it's been great. At UCLA, the Brewing for Recovery meeting, what I personally do, and I'll shut up, is that when I see someone coming into the room who's brand new, I'll reach out to them directly. And I'm a little bit more strategic about that when they're Black and look like me. I will send them a private message. I do that in all my classes, because out of 25 people, and you're the only Black person in the class, and another person shows up, it's important for me as an individual to reach out to them and let them know I see you.
Thank you so much, Tyrone, for sharing that. I guess in my experience, both on campus and off campus, speaking to what Dr. Link presented on, a lot of the self-stigma associated with seeking out help. You know, I am a third generation addict, if you call it that. And at home, I didn't have the
Bailey, I think you froze.
I think so too. I am going to ask a question that was put into the chat. So this is for Tyrone. How do we find a way to remove barriers for scholars coming out of prisons to find college? Thanks for your work. I am also formerly incarcerated and can't thank you enough for sharing your journey and lived experience. And this is a comment from Dr. Noel Vest.
So in my bio, I think there's a mention of a research project that I actually completed, and it actually focused on 2 programs. One at Cal State LA, which actually goes into the Lancaster prison, and they offer a bachelor's degree to those incarcerated, a bachelor's degree in mass communications. That is phenomenal in and of itself right there. When you're in prison, you need some form of hope. You need something, you know, there's that whole thing between corrections or between rehabilitation. So, you know, one of the barriers is going into the prison, catching them, the individuals before they get out. Underground scholars, Project Rebound, revolutionary scholars, we write to prisoners and start building those relationships with them. They're underfunded. They're not funded programs. They're struggling. Policy is driven by money. Donors want to sit up here and give money to organizations and programs, but they don't want to listen to where the systemic issue is, often driven by white supremacy and racism, racist policies. How do we address those policies? How do we change those policies? Donors want to give money to putting a Band-Aid over the problem and not addressing the original problem. So that's the ultimate problem right there when it comes to funding. We need to sit up here and address the root of the problem, what is going on, and work with deeper than the prison system, but we need to address the root of the problem and not just put a Band-Aid on it.
Great, thank you. And then our last question, this is directed for Dr. Link. If you say that someone with an addiction has a disease, can't that be stigmatizing, us self-stigmatizing? Does neurodiversity provide a better option?
Great question. And I guess one of the ways, and this applies to what Tyrone just said, one of the ways that the sort of the medical establishment tries to address these things is to think that by calling things a disease, they're going to get rid of the stigma. And it might help a little bit, but like Tyrone's just saying, you got to get at the root cause of a lot of these things. And it doesn't really block the problems from doing that. So I like your comment there a lot. I'm not sure I fully got it all, but if I, and I might jump off a little bit from what you really meant, but that these things aren't, you know, this or that. And if we think about them as diversities and continua rather than categories, then we're all sort of, you know, it doesn't separate us as much, not as much of that us, them. I'm not sure that's what you were saying, but I think that would be a good point coming from what you said. I'm not sure I nailed the response was, but it was a great question to ask me.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you everyone in the audience. I hope you all attend more of what we have for this conference. And with that, have a good day. Thank you.